In 1937, an Australian government official stood before a conference of state and federal authorities and asked a question. He asked it plainly, officially, on the record. Are we going to have 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth? Or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there were any Aborigines in Australia? His name was A.O. Neville. He was the chief protector of Aborigines in Western Australia, and over the next several decades, Australia answered his question with a policy. Between 1910 and 1970, the Australian government systematically removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. Not by accident, not in secret, as official, legislated government policy. These children are known as the Stolen Generations, and this is their story. Part 1. The World Before. To understand what was taken, you need to understand what was there. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had lived in Australia for at least 65,000 years, the oldest continuous civilization on Earth. Hundreds of distinct language groups, rich systems of law, knowledge, spirituality, and kinship. A deep relationship with land that formed the foundation of identity, culture, and belonging. When British colonists arrived in 1788, they brought with them a doctrine, terra nullius, land belonging to no one, and used it to justify seizing a continent that had been home to an estimated 1 million people. What followed was devastating. Frontier violence, disease, the destruction of food sources, population collapse. By the late 19th century, colonial authorities had decided that the Aboriginal population was dying out, and that something had to be done. What they decided to do was not protect Aboriginal people, it was to erase them. Part 2. The Policy. Beginning in the late 1800s and accelerating through the early 20th century, Australian state and federal governments began passing a series of Protection Acts, legislation that gave the government near total control over Aboriginal people's lives. Where they could live, who they could marry, whether they could work and for how much, whether they could receive their own wages, and, most devastatingly, whether they could keep their children. The ideology behind the removal policy was explicit. Officials like A.O. Neville believed that Aboriginal people of mixed descent, children with both Indigenous and European ancestry, could be absorbed into white society if they were taken young enough. Separated from their families, stripped of language, culture, and connection, raised as domestic servants or farm laborers in white households or church-run institutions. The goal was not welfare, it was eradication. Not through mass killing, the language was careful, bureaucratic, almost clinical, but through the deliberate destruction of a people's ability to pass their culture to the next generation. In 1997, a government inquiry would find a word for this. That word was genocide. Part 3. How it happened. The removal didn't happen the same way twice. Sometimes government officials arrived with police. Sometimes it was missionaries. Sometimes welfare workers. Sometimes the children were taken from missions and institutions where families had already been relocated. Sometimes they were collected from hospitals. Parents were given little or no warning, often no explanation, no paperwork, no legal recourse. Mothers described chasing vehicles down dirt roads. Fathers described being held back by police while their children were loaded into cars. Children described not being allowed to say goodbye. In many cases, families were told their children were being taken temporarily, for schooling, for medical care. Many were never returned. Children were taken to institutions, government-run homes, church missions, training centers scattered across the country. Once inside, they were given new names. Their birth dates were sometimes changed. Their religion was changed. They were forbidden from speaking their language, forbidden from practicing their culture. In some cases, forbidden from acknowledging they had a family at all. One woman, testifying to a government inquiry decades later, said she and her siblings were told their mother was dead. Their mother was alive. She had been looking for them for years. They weren't reunited until they were adults. Part 4. The Children. The most famous story of the stolen generations belongs to 3 girls. In 1931, 3 Aboriginal girls, Molly, 14, Gracie, 11, and Daisy, 9, were taken from their home in Jigalong, Western Australia, under A.O. Neville's orders. They were transported to the Moore River Native Settlement, 1,500 miles away. Within days of arriving, Molly decided they were going home. They followed the rabbit-proof fence, a 1,800-mile-long wire fence running north to south across Western Australia, using it as a landmark to navigate through terrain they had never seen. No map, no supplies beyond what they could forage. In the Australian outback, barefoot. Trackers were sent after them. Neville himself coordinated the search. It took 9 weeks. After 9 weeks of walking, 2 children and 1 teenager, they made it home. The Australian government removed Molly again 2 years later. She escaped again, this time carrying her infant daughter on her back. Her daughter, Doris Pilkington, grew up to write the book that became the film Rabbit Proof Fence, so the world could finally hear what her mother had walked through. That story is extraordinary, but it is not unusual. Across Australia, through 6 decades, tens of thousands of children lived versions of it. Part 5. The Numbers. The Bringing Them Home report, published in 1997 after 2 years of testimony collection, is 689 pages long. It contains the testimony of more than 500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It estimated that between 1910 and 1970, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 3 Indigenous children were forcibly removed in some regions. The total figure across the country, an estimated 100,000 children. 100,000. The report found that the removal policies constituted a gross violation of human rights. It found that the suffering inflicted was not incidental, it was intentional, systematic, and sustained over generations. It found evidence of physical and sexual abuse inside institutions. It found that children were placed in situations of forced labor, unpaid or underpaid, with no means of escape and no legal protection. And it found something that reverberated far beyond history. It found that the trauma didn't end with the people who were taken. Part 6. The Wound That Doesn't Close. Here is where this story stops being history. Today, 1/3 of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander adults in Australia are descended from stolen generations survivors. 40% of Aboriginal children aged 0 to 18 are growing up in a household where a parent or grandparent was forcibly removed. The children of survivors, people who never personally experienced removal, show elevated rates of mental illness, substance abuse, and family violence that researchers directly link to unresolved intergenerational trauma. Grief passed down not in words, but in the silences, in the absences, in the absence of grandparents who were taken before they could pass on language, ceremony, story. Studies have found that Aboriginal people with high rates of childhood trauma, including stolen generation survivors, are nearly 3 times more likely to develop dementia than other Australians. The policy ended in 1970. Its consequences are still being measured. And there is a particular cruelty in the specific thing that was taken, not just children, but the transmission of culture, language, story, identity, the things that a people pass from generation to generation, parent to child, elder to young. Once broken, that chain is almost impossible to repair. Children who were taken often couldn't teach their own children what it meant to be Aboriginal, because they had been raised to forget. That forgetting was the point. That forgetting is the inheritance. Part 7. Sorry. For decades, the Australian government did not apologise. The Bringing Them Home report was tabled in Parliament in May 1997. It contained 54 recommendations. A national apology was the first. The Howard government, in power at the time, refused. Prime Minister John Howard declined to say sorry, arguing that the current generation should not be held responsible for the actions of past generations. For 11 years, the word sorry was not said. On February 13, 2008, that changed. Newly elected Prime Minister Kevin Rudd stood before Parliament with thousands of Aboriginal Australians watching on screens outside, and he said it. "We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country. For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants, and for their families left behind. We say sorry." People wept in Parliament. People wept in the streets. Survivors who had waited their entire lives for those words heard them at last. It was a significant moment, but an apology is not reparations. Of the 54 recommendations in the Bringing Them Home report, the majority remain unimplemented more than 2 decades later. The gap in life expectancy, health outcomes, and social outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians persists. Aboriginal children today are overrepresented in out-of-home care at rates higher than at any point during the Stolen Generations era. The policy is over. The conditions that made it possible, the willingness to see Indigenous lives and culture as expendable, have not been fully confronted. Part 8. What we owe the truth. The stolen generations are not a distant historical tragedy. They are not something that happened to another country, in another time, to people sufficiently unlike us. They happened in a modern democracy, in living memory, to people who are still alive, to families whose grandchildren are alive right now. The woman who chased a car down a dirt road in 1935 trying to reach her children, her grandchildren are alive. The boy who was told his mother was dead and didn't learn the truth until he was an adult, his children are alive. The girl who walked 1,500 miles through the Australian outback to find her way home, her daughter wrote a book about it, so we would know. History is not over. It is the ground we are standing on. And for the stolen generations, for their children, and for their grandchildren, the question of what is owed is not a historical question. It is the question of right now. 100,000 children, 6 decades, one word, sorry, that took 38 years to say. The stolen generations survived something designed to make them forget who they were. Many of them held on, passed what they could to their children and their children's children, fought for recognition, told their stories again and again until someone finally wrote them down. We can at least listen. If you want to understand more about the ongoing impact, or about Indigenous Australian history more broadly, there are links in the description to resources directly from the communities most affected. Their voices should be the loudest in this conversation.